We have been asked in this panel to look a little bit closer to different perspectives in security demands. I have the opportunity to present to you very briefly the experienced representatives of the region we are in and of the two Germans who are allowed to be there also. First, we have one lady from Georgia. You have met her already, Mrs. Tinatin Khidasheli. She was the first female defense minister of her country, and from 2015 to 2016. But more important, I think, is the role she has right now, where she started her political life. And that is to be one of the leader of the civil society. Very important in the development and in the reform processes of our countries. And she is fighting for human rights, for the rule of law, and for the eradication of state corruption. Not very easy. We have from this country a former officer, with an academic with military background, Oleksiy Melnyk. He works in Kyiv as co-director of the Razumkov Center. And from Poland, we have Bartlomiej Nowak. He acts as Foreign Affairs Secretary of the Nowoczesna. Nowoczesna means the modern, and it's a Polish liberal party which is in parliament since 2015. So among liberals, of course, he is always welcome in this area. These persons, these representatives, are well prepared to inform us about their point of view in the security perception, specifically from their countries. Another well-known academic is Dr. Andreas Umland, and among many other functions and academic activities, he is advisor of the parliament in Ukraine. There are not many Germans who made it as an advisor for the parliament in this country, so we are glad to have him here. And before I hand over to Andreas, who will give us his first 10 minutes on the dilemma factor we have in this part of the world, and the other panelists will concentrate in 10 minutes on the point of views of their countries, because this is something we cannot know, we cannot learn from the papers, but we learn it from them. Before Andreas takes over, I would like to give you a very short episode from my own NATO experience in this area. It happened in Tbilisi, Georgia, in the year 1993. My last job as an army colonel of the German army was an advisory mission to Georgia to support the Georgian government in disarmament organization. Some weeks before, we came there with our small team. However, the Russian Federation had already, let me say, executed the disarmament problem of Georgia. How did they do it? Before the Russian troops left Georgia, they simply destroyed most of the weapons of the Georgian army, and at the same time, they ravaged all military infrastructure. So in this situation, we came as a disarmament team to Georgia, and the acting defense minister at that time was, and at the same time, chief of staff. He was a colonel from the Georgian army, with the uniform of an Soviet artillery colonel, and he was acting defense minister. So he took us into his office, and then he told us, you're on the phone, He told us directly, help us to join NATO. We must be members of NATO. How about tomorrow? That was what he said. So, closing this episode, ladies and gentlemen, we were eyewitnesses of a shift of perception in former Warsaw Pact countries or states. For the whole Warsaw Pact, we had been enemies, NATO, but I think with the exception of Russia, of course, most of the ex-Warsaw Pact states, or maybe all of them, became of the opinion, had the opinion that NATO is not an enemy anymore, but it's a savior. Now, 24 years later, we look again at different security perceptions. And I would like Andreas now to carry on.
Speak mainly about the what is in German sometimes called Zwischeneuropa, in between Europe. We had yesterday already a documentary about the East European NATO member states. I want to concentrate on those countries that are sort of between NATO and the CSTO on the other side. That means, first of all, Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, and I will leave out here Azerbaijan because it's a special case, too complicated to discuss here. And I briefly want to outline the dilemmas that we have here with this zone between the CSTO and NATO. And as I see them, 6 basic scenarios and the dilemma each of these scenarios has. So the 6 scenarios are the continuation of the current gray zone that exists. The second is a neutrality or Finlandization of this territory. The third has been mentioned already, NATO membership. The fourth, EU membership. The fifth, major non-NATO ally status. And the sixth, an intermarium, an East European security alliance between the Baltic and the Black Sea. There is an asymmetry between these 6 scenarios. The first one is the by far most likely, the gray zone scenario, basically the continuation of the current situation that we have. And the other 5 are major new agreements, treaties that would change the structure of Eastern Europe and that are far less likely than the continuation of the current gray zone scenario. But I think it is necessary to discuss these other scenarios as well. The 5 major treaties that could be made, because they are discussed a lot. Each of them are discussed a lot in Eastern Europe and in Western Europe. And also, I think there's a problem with the gray zone scenario, because basically the current prolongation of the current situation in Eastern Europe, although I acknowledge that it is the most likely scenario, it is of course basically a continuation of the previous scenario that we had. And we know already that the previous scenario, the gray zone, what this scenario has led us to. So I see that it is the most likely scenario, and I don't think the other 5 scenarios will soon be implemented. But it is exactly the scenario that got us into the situation that we are in today. And basically the question here, the dilemma is, can cooperation and association replace integration? So what many people have in mind is that somehow without a major new treaty for Eastern Europe, sort of baby steps can get us into sort of a different world than the one we had already before 2014. And I'm not sure that is going to work. I mean, one has to pose this question. Are these many baby steps that are currently undertaken by all sorts of organizations, all sorts of countries, really lead to a qualitative change in Eastern Europe? Or are they a mere destruction at the end of the day that basically sort of cover the time until we will have the next new major escalation? This is the dilemma we have here. And I wouldn't exclude that you can achieve something with these baby steps. You can have, lots of, the association agreement and NATO cooperation between NATO and Georgia and Ukraine and all sorts of engagement. But I wonder whether this is really going to work. But there are signs that, Western leaders are acknowledging the problem. So I was, for instance, encouraged by the just made statement by the G7 that announced that there would be new sanctions if there's a new escalation. What I would wish for is now that, for instance, the EU would actually list the new sanctions that it would impose in case there is a new escalation. For instance, Russia cannot build the Kerch bridge from Russia to Crimea and decides to create a land corridor between the Donetsk basin to the Crimean Peninsula, which would be a major war on the Azov Sea. So, and for this case, I would wish, one of the many baby steps that the West could do is to give a list of what the EU would then, what kind of sanction it would impose. So this is the most likely scenario. I think in a way that's the only scenario that is really worth discussing. But I want to also mention the other ones. Neutrality. That's the most popular in the West, especially in Germany. The idea we will all get into a room, we would make some sort of large treaty, and Georgia and Ukraine and Moldova is already block-free anyway, but they the West would announce that they will not become EU and NATO members, and there would be some sort of large Finlandization, something like that. The problem with this is, of course, that we have already documents, for instance, from the NATO Bucharest summit of 2008, where Georgia and Ukraine have been promised membership. The EU would have to basically disavow its Article 49 of the EU treaty that each country can apply. Also, it would obviously ignore just the national interests of Georgia and Ukraine and Moldova by excluding them officially from an EU membership, and it would undermine the non-proliferation treaty as regards Ukraine, because it would mean basically that Russia has infringed upon the political sovereignty of Ukraine, and that would be another undermining of the non-proliferation treaty. NATO membership we have already discussed here. The dilemma with NATO membership is that probably Georgia and Ukraine will only get into NATO when they will not need it anymore. So that's the basically absurd situation. And I'm trying to say that as much as possible in Ukraine, because it's still very popular. It's among experts, diplomats, politicians. Most people, or many of these people, many of the even renowned experts in my own institute, to think that the main problem of Ukraine and also of Georgia has been that they have not knocked loud enough on NATO's door. And if they only knock now loud enough on NATO's door, it will open one day. If they conduct a referendum, if they adopt standards and so on, that at the end of the day, NATO will let them in. I know the situation in Germany. I think, NATO is not a supranational organization. All the 28 or 29 member states will have to agree. There will be always some West European NATO members who will veto Georgian or Ukrainian membership, as long as these countries have the conflict with Russia. The EU membership scenario is maybe less fantastic than it sounds. I think the association agreements are underappreciated. These are, in fact, I would call them integration agreements. They are very different from the association agreements that the EU has with other countries. They prepare these three countries for membership. And when these association agreements will be implemented, and that will take many years, actually, the final step towards legal and political membership will be small, because these countries will already be de facto parts of the EU economic sphere. And EU membership actually would provide considerable security assurances. I think in a way Estonia may be now more protected by its EU membership than by its NATO membership, because Russia would maybe love to demonstrate to NATO that it is not a reliable alliance by occupying some small part in eastern Estonia, but it would then have to fear tougher EU sanctions. The fifth scenario is the major non-NATO ally status. It was for Ukraine, for instance, discussed briefly in the US Congress in December of 2014, and in March 2017, the Verkhovna Rada, the parliament, adopted a resolution to this effect. The problem with this, the dilemma with this scenario is, well, it hasn't been implemented so far. So there were 3 years when the US could have given Ukraine and perhaps Georgia as well, and even Moldova perhaps, this status, but they have not received it now. Maybe under President Pence, if we have a very hawkish new US president, something like that could happen. I wouldn't exclude it, but for now I think it's a political fantasy, and one has to acknowledge it. To upgrade the Budapest Memorandum to a treaty would be also a great idea, and one could refer to the interests of the whole of humanity, preserving the integrity of the non-proliferation regime. The problem with that would be it would basically leave Georgia out in the cold, because Georgia did not inherit any nuclear weapons. It was not part of the Budapest deal of 1994. So if you upgrade the Budapest Memorandum, the Russians could just say, okay, then we go to the Caucasus. If they could simply choose another playground, and then so that's a dilemma with the Budapest Memorandum. And finally, the Intermarium, the East European Security Alliance. I think it would be actually the most natural thing to happen if you think in very abstract terms about international relations. You have a large threat. You have countries who feel threatened, and they should have an alliance. That would be the logical thing to do here. The problem here is that the central connection would have to be the Polish-Ukrainian one, which is now unfortunately being undermined by both Polish internal problems in its foreign policies, in its domestic policies, but also by Ukrainian memory policies, which have actually, I think that's the main thing that has gone wrong after the Euromaidan, in a strategic direction that Ukraine has taken, I think, a disastrous memory policy line that has fundamentally alienated Poland from Ukraine, and now basically every part of the Polish-Ukrainian relationship is sort of poisoned by this issue about the Volyn massacre of 1943-1944. Often, sometimes people, a final note maybe, if I have still some time left, is that sometimes people say an East European security coalition is not possible because it would mean an alliance between NATO members and non-NATO members. And obviously that would be a problem, because the NATO members are, of course, already bound by their obligations within NATO. But there is a precedent for that. In 2010, Turkey has concluded what is very, innocently called a strategic partnership agreement with Azerbaijan, but in fact, which is, however, in fact, a mutual defense pact between Azerbaijan and Turkey. And Turkey is a NATO member, Azerbaijan is a non-NATO member, and moreover, it is an Eastern Partnership country, and it has a sort of an indirect territorial conflict via Armenia with Russia. So it's structurally, actually, although it is an authoritarian country and very dissimilar from Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova, it is in the structure of its international relations, it's somewhat comparable to the three associated countries of the EU. So this red line has been already overstepped. So in fact, this Turkish-Azeri treaty, which actually presumes Turkish military assistance to Azerbaijan in case of an attack on Azerbaijan, could serve as a model, if only there were the sufficient political will to do something like that in Warsaw and in Bucharest. Of course, there would have to be also some agreement from Brussels, Washington, Berlin, Paris, and so on. But if there is this will, this could be done. I think the problem being again that the Polish-Ukrainian relationship is now so difficult that this scenario may also not be implemented. That was it for me. So.
Thank you a lot for the quick run through legal, political, and structural hazards which may happen in this total process. after this general approach, we look now for the national things. Ms. Khidasheli, would you please continue?
Thank you very much. And thank you for this introduction. It really makes me, my desire to respond is pretty high, but I'll try to have some of those issues covered in my introductory remarks. But I will start with the question that you have absolutely rightly posed, whether those, as you've called it, baby steps, the being it association agreement or the NATO-Georgia package in our case, and or NATO-Ukraine Commission and so on and so forth. There are lots of instruments between NATO and those partner countries available. Whether those steps will actually lead to any significant resolution of problems and get us anywhere closer to better security architecture? Well, the answer is yes and no, obviously, as to any question, depending on the circumstances. But I would say that the answer to this question very much depends on an answer to a more important or bigger question that is out there. And here I'll try to focus more on my country, as I know it much better, and I can go into the deep and dark details of this cooperation more. But I believe that it's no big difference with Ukraine or Moldova or any of those countries in a gray zone, as you've put us nicely in, that are out there in today's world. And this big question is, what is the role NATO or European Union, as we are talking about those two institutions, see for Georgia? Where does NATO or European Union sees Georgia? Does it see Georgia at all as such? Or it's just a matter of controversy that Georgia somehow knocks too much on different doors and walks too much in different corridors and makes too much noise and speaks too loud. And this is why sometimes we need to talk about Georgia, but in real terms, we do not really know where do we see this country, or do we see this country at all in the near future or in the next 20, 50 years to come? I think the answer to this question will solve everybody's problems. We will not be naive anymore. We will not be stuck with the mistake of Bucharest, or the decision of Bucharest will be seen as an opportunity and paving the future cooperation or integration for Georgia into those institutions, especially NATO. There are several options, obviously, and there are several questions, sub-questions or sub-issues to this Georgia, the rest of the democratic world agenda that need to be answered very clearly, very directly, and very honestly, I would also say, to avoid more suffering for everybody in these terms. Well, the first sub-question for me will be, what is the price for Georgia? What is the value of Georgia? Is it just its geography? Is it just a piece of land we are at the Black Sea that might be used as a balancing power on the Black Sea, which is seriously shifted against NATO interests after losing Crimea? Is it just a piece of land that is the only piece of land on land? I don't mean on sea or otherwise, but on the land that is connecting Europe with Asia, and that's the value of Georgia. Is it the only piece of land where all those pipelines are flying without the influence and without the interference from Russia, or without the ownership of Russia? Because if you look at the map, and I believe all of you have looked at this map many times, if you look at the map, everything north of Georgia, Georgia proper, Georgia which is under the control of its legitimate government, is Russia. Starting from South Ossetia all the way to the North Pole, you have Russia, you have Russian physical military boots standing all across that map. And if you look south of Georgia, starting from Georgia-Armenian border, where you have another Russian military base, all the way down, you have either Russia, or you have, you name it. You have Iran, you have Afghanistan, you have Syria, you have current Turkey, and so on and so forth. And there is just this one small corridor, which is only, I don't know, 80 kilometers wide, that we Georgians call as a freedom corridor in that part of the world, from north to south. The only free 80 kilometers where you can have anything good, anything positive, anything democratic, anything valuable done. And that's the only territory which can be partner to all of you, to Western European powers, to the United States, or you name it, anybody. That's one thing, one aspect of Georgia, the geography, the land, the air. And there have been lots of moments in the most recent history when there were no-fly zones on the north of us, east of us, south of us, when Georgian airspace was the only airspace available there for, I don't know, being it the goods from Afghanistan going to their final home destinations or backwards, and so on and so forth. The other dimension of Georgia, as we see it, is more valuable and more important to us, at least. And this is, once again, where we need clear and honest answers from our partners, whether it matters or not. Whether we are on our own or we can rely on help, support, association, or integration with the civilized world. And that will be the only democracy in that part of the world. And even so, only country with a chance of democracy for the foreseeable future in that part of the world. The only country out of the Soviet Union, obviously, other than Baltics, who we do not consider in that space anymore, fortunately for them and for all of us, which has a chance to prove that it actually works. All those years and all those dollars or euros you've been spending for promoting democracy, promoting rule of law, promoting freedoms, it actually works. And there are results out of it. And we have too many failures, I don't know, starting from Kyrgyzstan, which was seen as a window of opportunity in Central Asia, and too much money, too much energy, too much human resource spent in their American military base being located in there. And I personally was sitting in the chamber of the parliament of Kyrgyzstan on the day when they voted joining Eurasian Union Treaty. I was a rapporteur for Kyrgyzstan for the Council of Europe, and on that very sad day, I was actually in Bishkek and witnessing that decision making. And we can go, you've already named Azerbaijan with a label, and we can unfortunately say not too many positive in terms of democratic developments about Armenia either. Georgia stands as that country in there, like Baltics 20 years ago from the Soviet Union, where you can say that democracy works. And my third point is that Russia, obviously, I cannot avoid talking about them. Another major question which is there is, what is it Germans or French or Americans, for that matter, or people in Brussels, in both headquarters, being it NATO or the European Union, believe in? And when they talk or when they think or when they do their assessments and reports about the wars in Georgia and Ukraine. What is it? Is it Moscow really fighting Tbilisi and Kyiv? Is it anything Moscow tries to prove to Tbilisi and Kyiv by those military engagements? Or there is something else behind it? Or this is the war against you, actually, in Tbilisi and in Kyiv, proving that the policy of backyard policy, or the close neighborhood policy, or this is my sphere of influence policy actually works, and you have nothing to do, and the whole idea of spreading freedom and democracy is nonsense, and Russia constantly on a daily basis proves that it is nonsense. And it's just the backyard policy, and we, NATO and Russia, will be better off if we divide this world with the Article 5 and have a new Iron Curtain on Article 5 boundaries, and that's it. End of the story. Everybody will continue living in peace and prosperity and without any particular problems. We, Georgians, believe that this is not war against Tbilisi. This is not the war for Sukhumi or Tkhinvali. I don't know how many of you have been in South Ossetia, but for anybody who's been in South Ossetia, and with huge respect to these people and to those territories, but this is no land. I mean, this is just a big black hole in the middle of nowhere that nobody needs for anything. This is the piece of land that does not even have any access to Russia for half of the year if it's a bad weather, and which is completely locked to Georgia and has no chance of survival without Georgia if there is a heavy snow. And if that snow continues for more than 3 weeks, then they will suffer from hunger because the land is not even giving crops enough to feed their own population. But Russia is spending so much money in South Ossetia. Russia is investing so much in South Ossetia. President Putin is investing so much of his credibility in, for example, and we've seen it many times, there are two news on TV channels. One, G7 meeting or G20 meeting, world leaders meeting each other and talking about the global issues, about, I don't know, environmental problems or global security. And President Putin meeting President of South Ossetia exactly the same time. As a matter of what? As a matter of proving to Tbilisi that he has such a huge loyalty and love and affection for South Ossetia? Or as a matter of cynicism, saying that, well, guys, while you talk there, I do my business exactly in the places where you invested so much money, power, and interest over the years. So these are the three basic issues without answering which there is no way we can answer the question posed here already, or the question standing out there with Bucharest Declaration or any other declaration for that matter, or association agreement or DCFTA or any of those engagement policies that we have. Because at least what we deserve, and that's my last sentence, what Georgians do deserve for all these 25 years of, literally speaking, dying with European Union and NATO flags in their hands, for those flags legitimately being put on the ground of their own country, physically dying in numerous wars for the last 25 years, we deserve at least clarity. We deserve at least to be told, sorry guys, we can do it, or we pursue association agreement, we pursue the NATO commitments that we have today, and we will know that once this window of opportunity is open, we will jump in. Thank you.
A clear call for clarity. Thank you very much. Please, Oleksiy.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me first make some reflections on what's been said this morning and what's been said by my colleagues. Talking about Eastern security policy, I would probably argue that there couldn't be any, let's say, different security for like Eastern Europe, Western Europe. We may talk about different security perceptions, and we can talk about, let's say, different paragraphs in the overall European security, or maybe global security, since we have common threats, we have common challenges, and probably any nation has different priorities in these security perceptions. But at the end of the day, I don't think that we need to waste time to say how conflict in one part of the world affects security in Europe. Second, talking about geography. If we agree that there should be European security, and then we can talk further about indivisible security from Lisbon to Vladivostok, which was a great idea. But then you have to talk about the instruments, about the approaches. And one of your maybe or possible partners have absolutely different understanding how provide its national security. Because Europe and NATO been blamed and accused many times for interference, for expanding. And let's take a look how NATO trying to provide its own security, and the answer is by creating security environment. The other side has a completely different approach. They also trying to interfere, to influence their neighbors, but not by creating security environment, but by creating security or buffer zones. So can you find, or should we try to find common approaches? Because I think it's something that more like zero, not like win-to-win approach, but a zero benefit approach. So if we agree that geography does matter, but we shouldn't stick to the geographical borders, but rather talk about, I would say, civilizational borders based on values, based on common interest, based on common approaches to providing security for all, not just on the nationalist basis. And I think that the problem with NATO especially, and many other Western nations, that nowadays they fail to see the obvious, that we are already in the state of war. Fortunately, it's a Cold War, and I'm afraid that this is not already war of choice, but this is the war of necessity. And you have to take this challenge, and you have to develop your own strategy to respond to this challenge. If I have time, I will probably share some of my opinions about Russia, but let me jump a little bit down and talk what, from my point of view, could be possible relationship between Ukraine and NATO. My colleague Oleksiy mentioned already significant increase in the public support for possible NATO integration. That's true that some of the public opinion polls show that around 70% of Ukrainian people who declared that they would take in a referendum next Sunday, they would vote for, that they would support the idea of joining NATO. Is it enough? Of course not. I agree with the previous speakers that you have to create conditions and you have to seize the windows of opportunity. So Ukrainian homework, I mean, Ukraine is a state, Ukraine is society, to do everything possible and not just simply wait, but do everything possible to make this opportunity open and to use this opportunity. But for the time being, and for the, I would say for the next 5 years, I would not probably waste time bothering NATO knocking the door. Just give us another signal or another membership action plan. From the NATO side, I think that you're lacking also strategy, because I would agree with, again, with the previous speakers that you have to consider different security environments. You have to see it's possible, impossible, but it will bring you benefits or additional challenges. But at the end of the day, this is a whole issue of the political leadership. It's not just simply you are doing what is possible, but you are supposed to do what is impossible. And this is, I think, kind of problem, another problem that we face nowadays with the current, our probably Ukrainian leaders and European, Western leaders, that not only in this room, but on the political stage, most of the politicians were born after 1945. And they were educated and they grew up in a low-risk political environment, and they learned how to say politically correct and good statements, but they are not trained to take risk and take responsibility. And to conclude, let me tell you a small anecdote. I think it was 2 years ago, there was a YES conference in Kyiv, and we had two brilliant panelists, two former prime ministers. One was late Shimon Peres, And the second one was, I wouldn't tell his name, he was former British Prime Minister. He's still alive and still active. And both of them presented like 5 to 7 minute speech sharing their experience, knowledge, and giving advices to Ukrainian public. So when Shimon Peres spoke, everybody was taking notes. And I would say that probably I used these notes hundreds of times. The other British leader, I wouldn't mention his name, but he is a good friend of one of the Ukrainian oligarchs. He takes part. And former Prime Minister. Well, let's not go so close. But he made a very great speech. I mean, a lot of good slogans, a lot of political statements, but I failed to take any note. And Shimon Peres was talking about, I mean, his own experience, because almost every decision he was taking was very risky, and almost every second decision was not popular, was not supported by the general public or even his political party. But at the end of the day, because of his leadership, because of his courage, because of his political vision, he achieved such a great, success of his country. And let me stop at that great point, like kind of my slogan and my suggestion. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Oleksiy.
Let me maybe add at the beginning that I was completely dissatisfied with the Warsaw final communication, the result of NATO summit, with the statement on Ukraine. It was very weak, which we should have written something more courageous. And I must admit also that Georgia had explicit statement when it comes to its future in NATO, in Warsaw. But when it comes to the NATO-Warsaw summit, let me say that from a Polish perspective, but I think that from the perspective of Eastern European countries, it should be the beginning of transformation and adaptation to a new security environment. The beginning, not the end. Because on the East, I think that we all know that we cannot successfully deter Russia if it chooses aggression. We cannot defend some of our Eastern members of NATO against Russia. It is far away from that point. So all the Warsaw Summit statements, the sending of the battalions, it is a significant improvement, but it's just not enough. Therefore, I say about beginning of transformation, and we must continue this. And today, I think it is with the question mark. If NATO fails in the East, it is the end of NATO. We must be also very explicit. And militarily, we are far away from the point we can deter Russia. So in a sense, it is an existential issue for NATO, the eastern flank. So my thesis is that in order to prevent conflict, we should have more of a mindset of war fighting than a mindset of engagement. So we must show our willingness, our political and military will towards the East, as a NATO, as a whole community. Because we've got today much more challenging environment to deter, and if you look at the conflicts, the cost of failure at the initial stage of conflict is today very, very high. It's much higher than it was in the past, the initial stage of the conflict. So we need very rapid political decision-making in NATO, and to move also systematic contingency planning. Second, today we all know that NATO suffers from inadequate and unbalanced defense capabilities and capacities, particularly among European allies. which today have to cover two great range of missions and tasks and too high level of costs with too few assets. And the remarks of Donald Trump during the NATO summit in Brussels, I would interpret them a little bit differently than our colleague, Prime Minister from Estonia, because I would say that this is obvious that we must take more burden as Europeans. But what Trump was talking about, it was not that in future we must increase expenditures in defense. He was talking about the debt we do have as Europeans to Americans. This was all his rhetoric also against Germany previously. So he's got a very different understanding of what NATO is, and I think it's a political threat for the alliance because he sees it transactionally, not necessarily as a when Obama was talking about equal burden sharing, the second sentence he always used, but whatever happens, we stay behind you. And Trump does not say it, and it's a big trouble. So on one side, we may say that we've got 3.8% bigger spending in 2016 than in 2015, and it is like $10 billion. So it is a step forward. But on the other side, 80% of expenditure in NATO today comes from non-EU countries. So it is a big challenge because one of the main tasks for NATO adaptation is the so-called affordability. That means we must develop critical military comparative advantage in at least 9 areas of security and defense. And this is air, cyber, land, sea, space, information, knowledge, education, and resiliency. So it's a big task ahead of us. And the risk in the future politically is that we'll have Anglosphere versus Eurosphere in NATO when Great Britain come out of the European Union. So what does it mean? What question does it pose? This is the question about political dimension of the alliance. And we've got in NATO assumptions and NATO task the so-called projection of stability. What is projection of stability concerning the East? And I think this can only be achieved through transformation of the region. That means through very active policy, not just simply looking for stability. So I reject the options of the so-called Finlandization, because this is like 19th century option. We are not here. I think that every nation has its own right to choose its own destiny and the alliance. But obviously it will be very, very difficult. And the cooperation between NATO and the EU in transformation of this region is absolutely essential. But the second dimension we must remember, and very often in the Central European countries we forget about this, and this is the South. What does the South mean for NATO? Obviously we want to share our own perspective because we want to advance our interest in NATO, but we must be very careful in not omitting what is happening in the South. Yes, I finish in a moment. So in the Arab world, we'll soon have 600 million people, more than in the European Union. Today, 45% of terrorist attack comes from the Arab region on the global scale. Almost 60% of refugees comes from that area. And almost 70% of deaths related to conflict also come from that area. So what is the implication for when we are talking about fighting ISIS as NATO? Okay, is this just fighting ISIS, or it is a more political challenge of try to transform and influence on our neighborhood? So this is the question we must pose. In other words, do we need a grand strategy as NATO? And my last remark, obviously, it gives the question about the role of Europe and the European Union. And in the EU global strategy, there is an assumption that we should go into the autonomy of Europe. Autonomy meant on that time, when it was created in 2015, that we should have the capability to take an action if the US is not very much willing to join us. But on principle, it was projected in agreement with the United States. Today, we may have a situation in which we'll have to take action as Europe in disagreement with the United States. So this is a very tricky situation. So what we need definitely now is to thinking very seriously about real pooling and sharing, about harmonization of procurements both on national and European level, and about European defense initiative that we must develop. And last issue that I not mention, I'm very much in favor of keeping the policy of open door when it comes to NATO. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have only 2 minutes left. You have a short point, dear Andreas, so do it.
Maybe just continue with the open door of NATO. I mean, that's in a way your presentation illustrated the basic dilemma here. So deterrence is certainly good, and it's great to have these battalions now in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. But the problem here is that it's twofold. First, with these forward troops in these countries, the Russian narrative internally becomes, the paranoia becomes more plausible. And and the question is, who's going to pay for this paranoia? Are these going to be Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, or Poland, or Georgia and Ukraine? That's the first, you have this deterrence, and Russia is deterred and may react to the deterrence, and who is going to pay? That's the second is you have these battalions now, and it's great. But if you have an open door policy, I mean, imagine Georgia and Ukraine would enter. I mean, they would then have to have their battalions as well, right? If Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland have, and imagine Ukraine and Georgia come in, maybe they should also have each 1,000 troops from, But the problem is, of course, that this policy now creates another hindrance and stake for entry, for accession, because German troops in the Donbass, or French troops in Georgia. This is these are the dilemmas we're in. You have your NATO policy and deterrence; it's all fine, but the gray zone is there. And also, what do you do? What does NATO do if, let's say, there is the Crimea issue is very central to the Russian regime. So if they don't build this bridge from Russia to Crimea, then the whole Crimea project becomes unsustainable, and they may decide to have to fight a war from the Donbass to Crimea, which would be a huge war, 500 kilometers, Mariupol, Berdyansk, Melitopol. Basically, the Ukrainian state collapses, and let's say you have just a third of the Ukrainian population flees to the EU, 15 million people. Let's say Poland gets 5 million Ukrainians. What is NATO going to do with these 5 million Ukrainians in Poland? Are you going to shoot Ukrainians on the Ukrainian-Polish border, or what is the EU going to do with that? What is the plan actually for this sort of? And this is a security issue, yeah. Or you have the Zaporizhzhia power plant, which is 250 kilometers away from the fighting zone, the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, not just in Ukraine, in Europe. If that blows up, what is NATO going to do with that? what is the strategy? Are you going to deter somehow refugees or nuclear particles, or what is going to be the strategy? That's the.
Andreas, this is such a devastating view in the end you brought to us, but it's of course it's also part of the game. I take myself. It's a pity that we cannot have an open discussion because there came so many good points from the contributors that would be worth to discuss. I take myself 2 minutes in the end. The first one is déjà vu. When I entered NATO, when I became a NATO soldier in the 60s, Germany was totally under control of NATO, all of West Germany. So I found out that the déjà vu is not a déjà vu, because our presence and the success of NATO defense we experienced in the past, coming to the unification of Germany. In this case, Germany was totally under control and totally willing to play Nolens, to play with NATO forces. We had millions of soldiers on German territory defending our country, and another million in East Germany, and so on and so on. So the contingency planning and all these things you need.
Yes, but I mean the groups are rotating.
The first speaker this morning
to talk again to the expert, because the expert is with
who talked about defense, what NATO should do. This NATO requirements ran over 30, 40 years on German territory. So it was not a problem that everybody was used to it. We could manage it. Here, it's not a déjà vu. This is a totally different situation where all these countries from another world, from an Eastern world, from other responsibilities, from other dependencies, where you come from, the Soviet Union, there's no comparison. So what I learned, if you allow me to say that as my final point, what I learned is there is not a second game, with not a second success we had with the German defense, the defense of Germany with NATO means in our territory. Germany was a defeated and a country that had lost the war, so we had to take in all of the things that came in. So it's a different situation. So if we want to have NATO defense here, I think we must be more tricky. That's what I learned. More tricky and more ideas for the future, for the development. It takes time, it takes a lot of discussion, it takes a lot of will. We have it, but a lot of brain also. And my very last short point is all these who learn how complex this is, and you gave us very good examples about the complexity as we had learned in the morning. I would add 3 words to that. When things get complex and you know about what's going on, tell it the others. Identify the problems, and finally, use plain talking. Get away from political hiding things. Maybe we should consider this and that. No, plain talking. That would be helpful for everybody who is engaged in the making the better process of his country and the security of our countries as NATO or theoretical NATO members.